So our next speaker is John Bevacqua from the Monash University Business School. John is Australian legal academic and commercial lawyer. He holds a PhD in tax law from the University of New South Wales, and he's recognized as an expert in taxpayers' rights and remedies. And John's presentation is on the reflections on digital by default approaches to tax administration in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So John, the floor is yours. We have 20 minutes for presentation, about 5 minutes for discussion and 5 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll give it a share my screen. Okay, well, thank you for that. My paper is, as the name suggests, a series of reflections on and attempts to predict the effects that COVID-19, the pandemic, might have on the transition to a digital by default tax administration. And I'll start by just putting the research and the paper into a little bit of context. So my home jurisdiction is Australia. And in Australia, there's been this sort of real fervour to digitalise tax administration, and that's sort of been continuing apace for some time now. And that's part of a broader phenomenon that we're seeing in a broad range of jurisdictions. And whilst the approach taken in every jurisdiction is obviously different, there does tend to be this sort of common aim for digital channels to become the primary form of primary avenue for interacting with taxpayers for providing services and information. And that's what I mean when I say digital by default in the Australian context. And of course, part of that transition to digital by default, part of that strategy is the concurrent reduction in traditional avenues, channels of interacting. Now, that's part of a broader push to e-government, or the transition to e-government that we've been seeing for some years. And there are some really good reasons for that, my paper doesn't really seek to challenge. So greater accountability, greater transparency, accessibility, and in the tax administration context in particular, efficiency is a big factor at play there as well. There's always been some calls for caution, particularly around privacy, cybersecurity, etc. But generally, there's been enthusiastic support for this sort of transition to a digital by default setting. If anything, the pandemic has enhanced or that enthusiasm. So understandably, we have commentary coming out of organisations like the UN saying that digitalisation has helped us to better deal with critical social and economic challenges like we've seen in the COVID setting. So my paper doesn't seek to challenge any of that. But what I think is worth examining is whether COVID-19 has raised and continues to raise some questions and uncertainties about how we go about that transition to a digital by default setting. So my paper uses the lens of my home jurisdiction, the Australian experience, to try and tease out some of those questions, some of those uncertainties, some of those potential issues that COVID-19 has kicked up that might affect the transition to digital by default going forward. And really, in a nutshell, in a broad sense, my analysis suggests that existing commitments and existing approaches to digital by default will, I think, need some adjusting and some re-examination so that we optimise our chances of getting all those benefits that I mentioned on the previous slide in a post-COVID setting. And so I'll now spend a bit of time, the rest of my presentation, just sort of explaining that central thesis, I suppose. Now, there are two things that I did in my paper. First, I looked at the behavioural and attitudinal responses to interacting digitally with the tax administration that we saw during the pandemic. And this is where I particularly focus on the Australian setting and what we saw in Australia during the early stages of the pandemic. And I think probably the more interesting and perhaps where there's some real interesting further work to be done is on the potential enduring changes in attitude that the pandemic might have brought about toward digital interaction that will have lasting consequences when the pandemic eventually ends. So first of all, just to give you a sense of what happened in Australia and the response that we saw to digitalisation and the use of digital channels. So in Australia, we had a series of economic and financial supports announced to help people struggling during the pandemic. There was a series of announcements made, but the majority of the measures introduced were introduced as part of a single package. And this package was quite helpfully announced via a press conference on a Sunday afternoon early in the pandemic. So, of course, what we saw on a Monday morning was the mad scramble for people to learn about what information was out there about these supports and how to access to sign up for these measures. And so what we saw was, first of all, high demand for digital services, and the government has a central portal for accessing government services, including tax services, called MyGov, and that promptly crashed catastrophically on that first Monday morning. And it crashed due to a lack of capacity to deal with the demand for those digital services. But what perhaps the more interesting phenomenon was that we also saw some unprecedented demand for traditional service channels, for those non-digitalised channels. So there were two agencies involved, the Tax Authority and the Australian Taxation Office, and the government's social welfare agency, Centrelink. And insofar as Centrelink was concerned, we had all these huge physical queues and crowds gathering at the offices, at Centrelink offices on that Monday morning, and for some time until everything sort of stabilised. Despite the fact that we had public health measures in place, obviously limiting social physical connection during this time, and the fact that people were putting themselves at some health risk by doing so. In the tax office, its systems held up relatively well, although you couldn't get to them necessarily because of that central MyGov portal that crashed. But what we saw within the tax office was unprecedented demand for telephone assistance. And so in the tax office, we saw a mad scramble to sort of redirect resources and people to help cope with that record demand for services, telephone services, despite the fact that digitalisation had been underway for a number of years and a number of very, well-established digital services available, digital avenues available. So this was sort of my starting point to try and think, well, what does this mean for digitalisation by default? And there are a few speculations I make here. The first one, and my apologies, by the way, if you can hear any birds squawking in the background. It's almost dawn on a Saturday morning in Australia and the birds are waking up, so my apologies. First of all, the presumption that most will gravitate toward and prefer digital interaction that underpins this sort of digital by default transition may be overstated, at least in an Australian context, if we look at these behaviours. Another possibility is that the transition may simply be going too fast. I mean, that had been recognised as a potential risk of the Australian Tax Office's transition already prior to the pandemic. And perhaps what we saw at the start of the pandemic is proof positive of that. There's also an interesting timing issue in the Australian context, in that the pandemic struck coincidentally at a time where trust and confidence in government and use of digital avenues was perhaps at its lowest ebb. We've had a recent significant issue with what has been known as the robo-debt problem, where the government and Centrelink and using the tax office information issued many thousands of automated debt notices, not death notices, to individuals that turned out to be grossly inaccurate and actually legally unenforceable. And so the government just coincided with the start of the pandemic that they had to end up accepting liability and for about $1.5 billion for the harm caused by this system. And that was broadly spread across the media at the same time. So perhaps what we're seeing there is some natural lack of confidence and trust in government systems because of the timing. I think there's another phenomenon that might be at play, and I think all of these things played into this in some way, and that is a distrust of digital channels among vulnerable taxpayer groups, where financial matters are concerned. There's certainly evidence both from Australia and abroad that groups like the elderly, for example, and some of the lower income groups are particularly hesitant or nervous about exchanging financial information via digital channels. And so perhaps we saw some proof of that. So just to bring all that together, you know, I asked the question whether the high demand for these traditional channels affirms that timing, education, and avoidance of high-profile system failures like the robo-debt issue that we've had in Australia may be really central and critical to the success of digital by default transitioning, more so than perhaps we thought. Maybe COVID has brought that to light. I also, in my paper, canvassed the possibility that, look, what we're seeing here really was just, you know, an irrational response. We saw plenty of irrational responses already during the pandemic, panic buying and these sorts of responses. And so I looked a little bit at the behavioural science literature in my paper to try and explain, you know, whether this, you know, a panic response was the way to the explanation for this, you know, reliance on non-digitized channels. And what I found there was an interesting, some interesting commentary that says that, look, where computer digital channels are concerned, where there is a history of ungraceful system failures, and that's the terminology which I quite like, where there are ungraceful system failures, you're going to, there is more likely to be these sort of panic-driven responses that draw people away from digital channels. And so I think that perhaps there's a lesson there to say that, look, if we're going to build these digital by default systems, there has to be sufficient spare capacity, sufficient backup fail-safe mechanisms to prevent these ungraceful system-like failures that might turn people away from digitalisation. Turning now to the, I think, the more enduring changes in attitude that COVID might have brought about, and, you know, we'll only learn what these are when the pandemic ends, I suppose, but I think there's some really interesting possibilities here that I canvass in my paper. So just a few of them. Could it be that increased reliance on technology that we've all had to do during the pandemic in many parts of our lives, like working from home or e-commerce or online entertainment, etc., could actually serve to accelerate acceptance and demand for digital channels and digital interaction? Or will people simply revert to their pre-pandemic preferences? The indications are, and there's sort of nothing I've seen in a tax context, but certainly in other contexts like e-commerce and in other industries that have benefited through transitions to online during the pandemic. The indication is that this is more of a permanent acceleration of the transition. But there's an uncertainty there. Certainly the barriers of traditionalism, lack of trust, lack of interest, and desire to invest in the technology may result in a greater embracing of digital by default after the pandemic ends. But there are also some other interesting potential phenomena that the pandemic may have brought about that warrant considering. For example, there is evidence that the pandemic has caused many people to increasingly become more fearful and suspicious of human interaction as a result of the potential health risk associated with human interaction. And perhaps that will drive an acceleration of demand for digital engagement. Of course, the opposite may also be true, that the lack of human-to-human engagement and interaction during the pandemic may make us more appreciative of traditional avenues of engagement. So you can see the uncertainties here, but there will be some effect, I think. Another interesting possibility is that the pandemic has eroded the fear, distrust, concern about invasions of privacy or cybersecurity, and greater acceptance of government intrusions in our lives than we might otherwise have accepted. So, as part of the pandemic, different countries around the world have implemented all sorts of monitoring mechanisms to ensure that people comply with public health measures. I mean, all of that might have implications for people being more comfortable with engaging digitally going forward in government settings and tax administration settings. Also, I think many people, there have been broad-scale improvements in digital literacy during the pandemic, and this could particularly be pertinent in tax administration settings in encouraging people to engage digitally. I say that because in a compliance setting, there is some evidence that people who are more literate about their tax obligations are more willing to comply voluntarily with their tax obligations. It wouldn't necessarily, therefore, I think, to be a stretch to say that people who understand the realistic risks and benefits of engaging digitally with tax authorities may be more willing to embrace digital engagement. So all of that seems a little uncertain. So I've made just a few very quick crystal ball predictions to leave you with. And there are others in my paper, but there's a few things that I think we can almost bank on in the wake of the pandemic here. Okay, I think, based on my analysis, the speed of the transition to a digital by default setting will increase after the pandemic. I think tax authorities who are left behind, who are not as far advanced or as committed to transitioning to a digitalised tax administration setting, will face increasing criticism and scrutiny and public demand for digital services. The second point I make here is a broad one, but I think the economic case, the cost and benefit analysis that underpins the transition to digital by default will need some serious re-examination. In particular, I think that investment in modernising technology and increasing digital communications will no longer be seen as a luxury, if it ever was. It will be seen as an operational need. And that quote there is actually from the United States Taxpayer Advocate, talking about the US setting, and I think that's an appropriate comment. I think that as part of this cost benefit analysis, big spending on upfront costs of digital transition and building that sort of excess capacity and fail safes to avoid those sorts of ungraceful system failure risks will become more acceptable to the public in the wake of the pandemic. On the other side of the ledger, the retention of traditional channels, I think there will be a reaffirmation, though, of the importance of retaining non-digital human interaction channels. But I think there is some uncertainty about what channels will prevail in that setting. In particular, certainly for some time, I think channels involving face-to-face contact may not be particularly popular, but certainly there will be some ongoing or perhaps a realization as a result of the pandemic that we do need to retain some of those traditional interaction channels, notwithstanding the march toward digital by default. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. Perfect timing. And I would like now to invite the discussant for this paper, Wei Ku from University of British Columbia. Thank you, Wei.
Great. Thank you, Nigar. I hope you can hear me, and let me start the slides. Okay, I hope you can see that. Thanks very much for the invitation to join this panel and comment on the interesting paper by Professor Bevacqua. I found it a very interesting read. I especially like the idea that this is a set of reflections on a fairly new approach in tech administration. I think reflections are what we need. Listening to this panel, to the experience in South Africa, in Estonia, and from Australia, to reconcile, connect these different experiences already requires exercise and reflection. So the general topic of digital taxpayer services captured by the idea of digital by default is fascinating. John starts the paper by defining it using language from Australia, from the UK. And so this is in some ways a comparative paper, covers Australia, New Zealand, UK, and the United States. But digital default is defined as the provision of digital services so straightforward and convenient that all those who can use them will choose to do so, while those who can't are not excluded. So this is a fascinating topic, and John anchors the study of the topic based on the experience of Australia, which I think of as an exceptionally, a country characterized by exceptionally good quality taxpayer services, and that's made possible by Australia being a wealthy country. So in this context, I think it's good to start by asking, what are the key goals of digital by default? And so I'm going to set out a list of questions for John. And so he already analyzes the issue from many interesting angles. I think by tackling some of the questions I list here, you may be able to connect with more readers and shed more light on this really important topic. So what are the key goals? One possibility is that we simply want to provide better, greater variety of services to our taxpayers, just as a greater variety and better digital services are enabled technology in other spheres of life. So we don't have to do things very different from before, in the sense of like Mr. Reitman mentioned, actually getting rid of tax declarations, perhaps. We keep on doing what we were doing before, but do it in a smarter way and provide better experiences. So that's one possibility. Of course, that itself needs to be fleshed out. Second, implicit in John's discussion, there's this idea of cutting cost. Maybe automation will cut cost. Here, there's a question of why. If there are lots of routine taxpayer services tasks that can be easily replaced by cheap computer programs, then of course we want to do that. But are we talking about that kind of digitization? Do we see room for that kind of radical cost cutting? And so, for example, earlier when Mr. Reitman talked about the experience in Estonia, one question that can be raised is, did this automation, digitization lead to either a short-term or long-term reduction of the cost of revenue raising? What is the change made to the cost of revenue raising? If we think about these, there are other possible goals. Maybe, as Mr. Reitman pointed out, we would actually transform tax administration by getting rid of things that we thought were fundamental, such as taxpayer declarations. So looking at the longer term evolution of these decisions, I wonder if it's useful to think about what determines these outcomes. So lack of competitive pressure experienced by government agencies may both reduce quality, so we expect quality to improve last among government agencies, but cost cutting may be cost may be less of a pressure than for business enterprises. Now I want to come to a set of issues. High quality taxpayer services is relative. And so there's an important question of what is the baseline level of service. That level of service can be very high in Australia, New Zealand, and other rich countries. And some of that may be enabled by a high ratio of tax administrators to population. And so that you can, it used to be that before the internet and so on, you can call tax administrators pretty easily and get answers. That's not uniform everywhere in the United States. There was not enough investment in taxpayer services. The ratio of tax administrators to population is very low. And so that's going to determine what kind of digital by default you choose. There's another important question. Should the contribution of third-party tax professionals, return preparers, for example, be held constant? Does digital default serve mainly taxpayers or tax professionals? A lot of the services were actually provided indirectly through the third-party tax profession. Is that supposed to be staying the same, or are we substituting entirely for that profession through government-provided services? The paper raises some other issues that are broader. So for example, John, you talk about digital services provided by other government agencies. We can reflect on how digital services to taxpayers may be different from other government digital services. Simplifying taxpayer services, a lot of it is about education, providing compliance-related information, and there's financial transactions. Relative to some other services the government provides, this does seem fairly simple, and so maybe there's greater potential for automating these transactions. And you also raise issues about inadequate access to digital services among parts of the population. That's true everywhere. And that's going to be true for all kinds of services, not just taxpayer services. All right. So if people don't have access to digital services, won't benefit from digitized taxpayer services. Finally, so I think all those issues could have been raised anytime. It's important to raise them. And because there are no clear answers, especially if you look at things comparatively, it's important to examine them. I'm not completely sure after reading the paper whether the COVID experience shed light on the previous questions. So for example, emergency response to the unanticipated by definition cannot be automated. And so the importance of non-digital may be coming from that. Any kind of automation needs protocols. You don't have protocols for unanticipated emergencies. You also argue that there will be more demand for the digital from both taxpayers and tax administration employees as a result of general societal shift. That seems to me very convincing. But simply on the basis of that, we don't necessarily have a better sense of what digital default should attempt to achieve in the medium or long term. But I think that's still a very important question. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei, for very comprehensive comments on the presentation. John, we have a couple of minutes. Would you like to answer to some of the questions before we wrap up this session?
Sure. Thank you so much, Wei. That's really excellent and insightful comments there. Yeah, all of the questions you raise are really valid, and I've sort of pondered on some of these questions as well. So, for example, you know, what's the driver for digital by default? I think there's this sort of disconnect. I think efficiency and cost saving is a major driver. And I think it's sometimes understated, but it's certainly a big factor there. I think that it's always framed in terms of supervision, but I think another major driver is actually the ability to utilize data more effectively to monitor compliance. And I think AI will increasingly shift. So I think digital by default started out as mere automation of, you know, fairly simple tasks, but is rapidly moving into the sort of more intelligent tasks and the more discretionary tasks. There is a greater potential. I think you mentioned the words greater potential there in the tax administration context, simply because the volumes of data, those giant data lakes that tax administration bodies have access to, is a goldmine for tax administration authorities to actually monitor taxpayer compliance and maximize revenue collection. And let's not forget that that's always a major driver there. But I think there is a disconnect, and I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, or the uncertainty, is that there's this disconnect between the public perception or the public message about the driver for digitalisation and the broader reasons for it, which are much more than just enhancing taxpayer services, I think. Yeah, I think there are a number of, I could talk forever about this. There's so many wonderful points that you made, but I don't know, I think we're probably running out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you, John. So for other participants, please post your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And we're finishing this session now, and we'll probably take another 5 minutes break before moving on to the next session. Thank you very much for coming to this session, and I hope to see you all in the next session.